There are certain moments in a cultural text, a book, movie, story, whatever, that break the fourth wall. Everybody knows that saying now. I remember when I first got introduced to that when I was a kid. It was like everybody's acting like they know what the fourth wall is. I don't know what the fourth wall is. But it just means coming out of the world of the story and crossing the barrier into the world of the now, of the viewer. And it feels weird. It's jarring. It's like when we went to Blue Man Group the other night and they came down into the crowd and started hanging out with people. It's bizarre. It's a different proposition. There's supposed to be this barrier, this division, but when you break that fourth wall, audiences tend to love it because it becomes more real in your own world. I think about one of the big punchlines at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia when Aslan, who clearly represents Jesus, is having that conversation. He's like, well, you know who I am in this realm, but I transcend all the realms. And I'm butchering this, but the paraphrase, I think, gets you to the gist. But now you need to find me in your realm. It's the same realm that you and I, the reader, live in. And it's like, whoa, this just went from a fairy tale to something that actually gets into my business a little bit. Let's go to the other end of the crassness spectrum. Deadpool, like his whole superpower. Well, one of his superpowers is that he transcends the whole thing, the whole genre. He knows he's a comic book character in a comic book, and you can do some interesting things with the writing there. Matthew kind of breaks the fourth wall here right at the end of the account of the guards, in that he is acknowledging his own writing. He is acknowledging that the story that you and I have been immersed in is coming after the fact, and he's acknowledging one of many presumed to be lingering truths that come out of the events we've been looking at here, but most of that has been assumed. Generally speaking, Matthew takes the posture that the reader is reading this because they heard about Jesus and it's a big deal, and they're trying to figure out exactly how it's a big deal, why it's a big deal, what exactly went down there. But here we get a detail that leaks into whatever is contemporary history as Matthew is writing this. And that question of when is Matthew writing this is something we talked about 3 years and 2 months ago. As I sit here recording this, all the way back at the very beginning, we looked at different theories, competing theories regarding the date of Matthew. The traditional position is one that's established by the testimony of a very early church father named Papias or Papias. I never know quite how to say it. And he suggested that Matthew was the first of the Gospels written in the language of the Hebrews, or written in their own language, indicating that maybe there's some kind of hybrid version that is Greek and Hebrew, or he conceived of it in Hebrew first and then it moved to Greek. I don't know that anybody really knows how to read the remarks of the church father in regard to the original language. I think most modern scholars think that it was probably just written in Greek, but I don't know. I'm nowhere near sophisticated enough at the biblical languages to make a good case that way, and I suspect that some of the people who bluster real hard about it, secretly they don't know either. But this early tradition is in conflict with a commonly held modern scholarship assumption, that is, that Mark was the first gospel written, and that then Matthew and Luke depended heavily on Mark as a source. And I mean, it could be, I think we broke all of this down before, but I'm not sure I totally buy that. I can see evidence for, I can see evidence against, but that order of operation doesn't really matter if you're looking at a basic date for Matthew. It looks like we're writing before 70 AD, that of course being the year of the destruction of the temple. And it looks like we're writing far enough after the events described here for people to be curious, even far enough after the events of the book of Acts and the pressure being applied to the early church in terms of this thing going out to all the nations, that Matthew would be like, hey, there's a lot of people hearing about this who were not eyewitnesses. We need to give them an ordered account of all of this. Also, there seems to be tension about whether Jesus' original intent was for there to be this new family of faith that transcended ethnic boundaries. And Matthew's thinking, I was there. I wrote that stuff down. I was paying attention. I definitely need to communicate to people what Jesus' intentions were in terms of this family of faith and the vision for it that does go beyond ethnic boundaries. So you just got to figure, like, how long would it take for those tensions to emerge after the events that are described in the book of Matthew, which we're placing around 30-ish AD during the reign of Tiberius and the governorship of Pontius Pilate. That at least gets us close. But how long would it take if this happened and a body was never produced and this thing starts rolling downhill and people are like, dang, maybe that actually is the Messiah, and you start to see tension developing between the Jewish leadership who were not able to snuff this out in the way they had clearly intended to, and people who are maybe not followers of Jesus, but increasingly this causes them to be more skeptical of their religious leadership, and further tension between that religious leadership and the enthusiastic followers of Jesus. And then how long would it take for that to get out to the Gentile territory, and for then the Gentile church to start interacting with the ethnically Jewish church, and for the understandable cultural tensions that we see start to play out specifically in Acts chapter 15 a few years after this? How long would it take for that to happen? Because those look like motivating forces behind Matthew's work. I say it can't be after 70 AD because there's a giant spike of the football that is left out of all of this, in that, I mean, Jesus talks about their house being left to them desolate, and all of this very clear judgment that he states overtly and in public against the religious leaders. And then we don't get to see that come to pass on screen. I think if that had happened, Matthew would have gone out of his way to include it. Of course, relatively recent scholarship, usually starting from a very skeptical position, but there are people of deep Christian faith who would hold this position as well. I don't agree with them, but I understand the position. They would say this was written by an anonymous author sometime in the 2nd century, long after Matthew was dead, and then church leaders and so forth just assigned the name Matthew to it. Again, at the most technical level, it is an anonymous document. Matthew does not name himself as the author, though he does include himself in a few of these scenes. Of course, one of the most obvious pushbacks on that theory, that all the Gospels are anonymous and that authorship was attributed after the fact to try to bolster the credibility of the Gospels, is that, well, if that's the plan, the church leaders who put names on these things did a really lame job of picking names. Why would you go with Mark, a relative nobody outside of Jerusalem and just someone who very few people would have known about or thought about in the grand scheme of all of these characters? Why would you have gone with Luke? I mean, a part-time travel companion of Paul who wasn't an eyewitness to any of this. John, okay, I get that's a pretty good name to put on it. He's part of the inner circle. The John one makes sense, but maybe that one was just inevitable because of how very long John lived. I mean, of all the Gospels, we get the closest to a written fragment of John to his actual lifespan. We're only a few decades from John's death to the first fragment we have. And think about it. I mean, that means it had to have been copied enough times in that short a span to circulate to the point in terms of redundancies that we would still have any chance of having it today. But Matthew as well. Think of all the disciples. I don't know. Think about what you know him for. He was a tax collector and he wrote Matthew. That's pretty much what you got. So it would be an odd list of choices to name these guys to try to bolster their credibility. There were certainly bigger names that you could have connected with these accounts if you'd really wanted to do that. The point of the conversation here is not to debate that, but I think it's a fruitful bookend, if we're imitating Matthew's impulse here, to take ideas that are important and examine them on the front end of things, then let everything unfold and then examine it again on the back end of things. But beyond that narrative thematic structure stuff, I think it's important to revisit this because Matthew is insinuating himself into the story here, not just as an eyewitness and a young man who was there, but now he's insinuating this older version of himself into the story as well, not just implicitly by having written a book, but explicitly by saying, I now serve as a contemporary, right now witness, decades or whatever after the fact, to the reality that this lie, this pernicious thing that has been happening, continues to happen all the way to this day. It's an interesting play there to break the fourth wall, but if part of Matthew's goal here is to explain to people what happened, to explain and give an ordered account of how we went from where things were to where things are, that would be a really important detail, because this is the smoking gun. If Jesus' body is still around, or people have confessed to the crime of stealing it, you kind of just wasted a bunch of time reading through his material and getting your hopes up. But if there's no body and nobody's admitting to it, and the claims of the body being stolen are flawed just at their source when you really stop and think about it, then this is a pretty important and pretty compelling thing you just read. So Matthew, strategically, to accomplish what he wants to accomplish with this book, he kind of has to break the fourth wall here and be like, I'm aware of the rumors. Totally aware. Let me spell it out for you. Yes, they are still being circulated to this day. Here is where those rumors started. Here's the very beginning of that lie. Kind of like digging back through things when there's a whole Twitter storm and it seems like suddenly everybody just magically has the same opinion and is tweeting the same thing. And you're like, wait a dang minute, where did that come from? Everybody's using the exact same language to advance whatever the idea du jour is here. And aha! That's where it started, right there. That guy tweeted at that lady, and then people took it and ran with it. That's what Matthew is trying to accomplish here, and that's why he's breaking the fourth wall, insinuating himself into the text, and the very act of doing so demonstrates that this is already a story and a system of beliefs at the time that Matthew's writing that has taken root, that is affecting things, where the stakes have continued to be high. If anything, the stakes have increased. I always like those break the fourth wall moments when the SNL actors start laughing because the jokes are funny and they're hanging out with their friends and having a blast in front of everybody. I like those moments where fantasy and storytelling leaks over into my world and shocks me out of my entertainment-only posture into genuinely thinking about myself and my world. And I appreciate the little move that Matthew is doing here with these remarks. I really am sad that we're just about done with Matthew, but I'm not going to complain about it anymore, I promise. Thanks for the little counseling session here. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.